Okay, so let's start over again. I want to welcome you all here. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. Thank you to the in-person audience as well as those on Zoom, and I assume you can all hear me. Just to let you know what's coming up. Okay, for anybody on Zoom, please mute yourselves. Coming up, the English Country House, Center of the Universe. This is next Tuesday, August 9th at 5:30, and it's at the Manchester Community Library. This will be an in-person program. The guest speaker will be Kurt DiCamillo. He is an American architectural historian and a recognized authority on the British Country House. He is a curator for the special collections at the New England Historic Genealogical Society in Boston, the world's oldest and largest genealogical society. And I just want to express my thanks to Anthony and Anne McLaurin for introducing Kurt to our organization. I'd like to thank GNAT TV for being here to videotape this presentation. And a huge thank you to the Keelan Family Foundation. Thank you, Don Keelan, today. During the Q&A, the in-person audience is welcome to raise their hands and ask a question when called on. For the Zoom audience, we ask that you please type your questions in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. This evening's guest has a career spanning over 40 years in international political and security matters, working for the United Nations and elsewhere. A resident of Manchester, he has given several talks on a wide range of topics and is a popular presenter among our patrons. We are always delighted to have him lecture. Please give a warm welcome to Derek Booth.
Good afternoon. I have a red coat at home and I was going to wear it, but I thought it might be too provocative. So instead of that, I have a little something. Just to mark out my identity. I don't expect to make any converts to monarchy this afternoon, but if you leave with a better impression, a more informed impression of King George III, then I shall be content. If I can get the slide. A great deal has been written about King George III. This afternoon, I'm not dealing with his whole reign, but simply the 16 years that he was your king, the King of America, and his relationship with the wording of the Declaration of Independence. I'm drawing largely on two books, Jeremy Black's George III, America's Last King, and The Last King of America by Adam Roberts, The Misunderstood Reign of George III. And of course, I've delved into the internet as well along the way. The flyleaf of The Last King here begins as follows. Most Americans dismiss George III as a buffoon, a heartless and terrible monarch with few, if any, redeeming qualities. And the best known modern interpretation of George III is Jonathan Groff's preening, spitting, pompous take in Hamilton, Lin-Manuel's Miranda, very masterpiece on Broadway. But this is how this quotation continues. Prejudiced and brilliant, persuasive opinions who appeared to make the king an evil to achieve their own political ends. Now I shall argue that in the Declaration of Independence, King George III was subjected to a litany of serious, and I suggest unfairly directed accusations. They were not general. They were an address to the parliamentary government under Lord North in London. No, they were using the personal pronoun he. They were personalised. They were addressed specifically to King George. And I know that you probably all learned some of this at school, but let me remind you of some of them. Establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. He has abdicated government. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts. He is transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries. The prince whose character is unfit, define a tyrant as unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And here are some more. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation until his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has endeavoured to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the law for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass other laws to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He among us in times of peace kept amongst standing armies without the consent of our legislature. He has effected to render the military independent of superior and civil power. And so it goes on. In all, the personal pronoun he appears 18 times, and he's accused of tyranny 3 times. Poor George, such a nice man, and so elegantly dressed as well. What on earth did George do to deserve such a calumny? Now, if modern Americans think about King George at all, they seem to view him as a tyrannical despot who went mad. And he certainly did go mad in later years. In 1810, by which time he'd been on the throne for 50 years, suffering, it is believed, from bipolar disease, but he was not a tyrannical despot. So I want to first look at him as a man. He was the grandson of George II. Unlike George I and George II, George III was actually born in England in 1738. His father, Prince Frederick, had been the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, but in 1751, Frederick died unexpectedly at the age of 44. This meant that George, then as a young man, became the heir apparent, and on the death of George II in 1760, he then inherited the throne at the age of 22. His reign then lasted 60 years until 1820. Now, although only 22, with the matter of further succession to the throne already in mind, serious thoughts have been given to George's marriage. Various suitable candidates were considered, and then it was decided that he should marry Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz in Prussia. George had never met her until she landed in England on the 7th of September 1761, and they were married the very next day. It turned out to be a very happy marriage. Unlike many other monarchs of his age, George never had any mistresses, and he and Charlotte had 15 children, 9 boys and 6 girls, 13 of whom lived to adulthood. George, in fact, was a dutiful, diligent family man. But in his upbringing and inheritance, George was not an everyday man. He lived in the age of hereditary monarchy, so he was brought up and educated by private tutors in the knowledge that he would have a special role and unique responsibilities. In addition to English, he was fluent in German, and his lessons included French, Latin, chemistry, physics, astronomy, math, geography, commerce, agriculture, and constitutional law. He was taught fencing, riding, dancing, and music. And by the time he was an adult, he could play the flute, the harpsichord, and the pianoforte. In addition, he lived in the early years of the Industrial Revolution. And just as Benjamin Franklin had a great interest in lightning, King George had a passion for science and a deep interest in clocks and the measurement of time. This is an astronomical clock made for him in 1765. In addition to giving the time of 30 locations around the globe, it showed the date and the month of the year, the phases of the moon, and the high and low tide at 32 seaports across the world. George had his own astronomical observatory, and he personally made calculations of the transit of Venus across the sun on June the 23rd, 1769, and he accurately forecast further transits of Venus, which were to happen in 1874 and 2004. He encouraged inventors, and here are two examples. And his collection of scientific instruments was later established as a museum and opened by Queen Victoria in 1843. He accumulated a library of over 65,000 books, which after his death were given to the British Museum in London, and they're there today. And he supported the new inventions of the age, such as the spinning jenny in 1765 and the construction of the first iron bridge in 1777. So in other words, in addition to being a diligent, dutiful family man, he was educated, he was cultured, he was enlightened, and in many respects, he was the modern man. And in addition to all this, he had other important qualities. Throughout his life, he was a very much a devout, practicing Anglican by religion, and as king, he was the head of the Church of England, with the authority to approve the appointment of bishops of that church. And conscious of his royal responsibilities, he was in favour of continuity, patriotism, obedience to the law, and the maintenance of good order. So, by nature, in both family matters and more broadly at home and abroad, George was paternalistic, he was upright, he was moral and honourable. He was no fool. So now let us look at him as a monarch. On inheriting the throne in 1760, King George III was not an absolute monarch. By that means a monarch with complete and absolute authority to make decisions, as in, say, King Henry VIII. After the expulsion of Catholic King James II in 1688, and his replacement by Mary II and her husband William, in 1701 there had been an Act of Settlement, which in addition to banning any Catholic succession to the throne, which is still true today, also restricted the powers and prerogatives of the monarchy, and it significantly strengthened the authority of Parliament. And by the 1760s, the monarchy was a constitutional monarchy, and power was a balancing act between the monarch and the king and the Parliament. And so it was Parliament that had the whip hand. Parliament was passed the bills. Parliament controlled the budget. Parliament controlled domestic and foreign policy and had authority over the army and the navy. The king's assent was needed for parliamentary bills to become law, but he had, as a constitutional monarch, he had no veto power. The definition of a constitutional monarch is somebody who advises, consults, and cautions, but cannot make decisions. So the Prime Minister selected his own ministers, although certainly the King's opinion and attitudes were important. And in addition, the King could make non-parliamentary appointments and members of the House of Lords, and could dispense royal patronage favours that were much sought after. The courts of law had already taken over the business of dispensing justice, and Parliament had become the supreme legislature. And add to all this, then, that George had to deal with the personalities of individuals, the competing ambitions of politicians, just as we have today, and the personal likes and dislikes among the characters involved. So power at the top, then, was a juggling match. George had significant influence, but he had very limited power. And then on top of that, there was the international situation. In taking the throne in 1760, George inherited a war, which had been going on several continents. This was the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, between Great Britain, Prussia, and Portugal on one hand, and France, Spain, Russia, and Sweden on the other. And it has sometimes been regarded as perhaps the First World War. And in this map, you can see the areas of contact coloured in pink. And as you can see, the combat was not just taking place in North America. It was taking place in other parts of the world, including India and the Pacific, and of course in Europe. 1759 had been a very successful year for the British abroad, known thereafter as the Annus Mirabilis, a marvellous year. It was the year of British military success against the French in several continents. The British had captured Fort Ticonderoga, driven the French out of Ohio, conquered Quebec at the Battle of Plains of Abraham, captured Guadeloupe and other islands in the Caribbean, repulsed the French at the siege of Madras in India, and by victories at sea it ended any real prospect of a French invasion of England. The part of the 7 Years' War that took place in North America was known here more popularly as the French and Indian War. Both the French and the British claimed land in the disputed Ohio Valley, and in 1754 the French had built Fort Duquesne, that's present-day Pittsburgh. George Washington, at that time, was a lieutenant colonel in the British National Colonial Militia Regiment, Virginia Regiment, and was much involved in battles against the French in 1754 and 1755, until the French were eventually forced out of the Ohio Valley in 1758. And so the whole war ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, as a part of which France ceded Canada to Britain and Spain ceded Florida to Britain. Britain agreed to return Guadeloupe and some of the other islands to France and restore Havana and Manila to Spain. And there was at one time a senior member of the cabinet in London who suggested that as Guadeloupe was rich in rum and sugar and Canada was of little trade value, it would make economic sense for Britain to keep Guadeloupe and just give Canada back to the French. This notion actually got nowhere, fortunately, but it is interesting to speculate how history might have been very different if the suggestion had been accepted and Canada had been given to the French. Now, the 7 Years' War was very expensive, and in London there was strong feeling that the American colonists should contribute financially towards the cost of their security and the provision of British military protection against the French and the Spanish and tribal depredations. The answer in Parliament was the Duties in American Colonies Act, more widely known as the Stamp Act, passed in 1765. And in England already, the payment of stamp duty was already an established practice. It was stamp duty on official documents, simply made them legal, and it was an inexpensive way of raising revenue. Now, this method was therefore simply expanded into the American colonies, in that the Stamp Act required many printed materials in the American colonies, including, of course, Canada, to be produced on paper, produced in London, carrying an embossed revenue stamp. And here are two examples of the stamps that were used. Printed documents, including legal documents, magazines, many other types of paper, even playing cards at $1 a pack, and dice at 10 shillings a pair. And it had to be paid in scarce British currency, not in colonial paper money. In its design, it was estimated that the Stamp Act might raise as much as £60,000. And yet this was no more than a quarter of the £213,000 that London estimated it was costing to maintain 10,000 British troops in the colonies. The colonies protested strongly on several grounds. First, on principle. For 150 years, the colonists had always been told that they were entitled to the same treatment as if they'd been born in Britain, where taxes could only be raised on citizens represented in Parliament. But the American colonies had no such representation in parliaments in London. Secondly, with the end of the French and Indian War, there was actually no longer any threat from the French and the Spanish or tribal Indians. And thirdly, the monies raised would be spent on paying for 10,000 British troops present. By 1765, the colonists felt that they were no longer needed. John Adams had some sharp criticisms. He said, revenue is still demanded from America and appropriated to the maintenance of swarms of officers and pensioners in idleness and luxury. Now, in London, there were also complaints. Benjamin Franklin gave testimony at parliamentary hearings, saying that if the Stamp Act was not repealed, the result would be, quote, a total loss of the respect and affection that the people of America bear for this country, and of all the commerce that depends on that respect and affection, unquote. British merchants and manufacturers pressed themselves for repeal, as their own exports were being threatened by boycott. And indeed, before the Stamp Act was a year old, it was repealed. But unfortunately, the damage was done. In fact, the Stamp Act was only the touch paper to other discontents that had been smouldering. There had been growing objections to other measures imposed on the colonists by London, such as the Sugar Act in 1764 and the Currency Act, also in 1764, ignoring totally colonial legislatures. And then, of course, as they do today, local newspapers fanned the flames of the protest. Now, none of these protests were levelled personally at King George. In 1765, he'd been he was only 5 years into his reign, and at that time he appears to have been publicly well regarded in the colonies. But being well aware of the costs of the 7 Years' War, he did understand the argument that the colonists should contribute to the costs of their own security. The Stamp Act had in fact been passed by a large majority in Parliament, and so as a constitutional monarch, as I said before, he simply had to sign it into law. However, as reports of grievances grew, he urged that it should be modified rather than enforced. And if the only options were enforcement or repeal, he actually declared himself in favour of repeal. And in March 1776, in the wake of this opposition that the Act had aroused, Parliament voted in favour of repeal, and at that time King George fully approved. Now, in subsequent years, as the 1760s and 1770s unfolded, Parliament in London imposed yet more laws and taxes on colonies. The Quartering Act of 1765 required colonial authorities to make available food, drink, accommodation and transportation to British forces stationed in towns and villages. Now, the quarters concerned were defined as, quote, inns, livery stables, alehouses, and uninhabited houses, outhouses, and other buildings. In the original draft in Parliament, it had included a clause requiring householders to provide accommodation for soldiers on demand. But this provision was deleted after George himself made it clear that he did not approve of this invasion of privacy. Even so, this assertion of British authority by a distant Parliament gave rise to yet more protests, and close association with rough and ready soldiers did not actually make good feelings with the colonists. In 1766 came the Declaratory Act, by which Parliament asserted its power to make laws and impose taxes upon the colonies. And a series of 4 acts passed in Parliament were also known as the Townshend Acts of 1767. The Suspending Act prohibited the New York Assembly from conducting any further business until it complied with the financial requirements of the Quartering Act. The Revenue Act imposed duties payable at colonial ports, and those duties fell on lead, glass, paper, paint, and tea. And all these measures threatened colonial self-government, especially the practice of taxation, and aroused agitation and physical violence in the streets, particularly in Boston. In turn, in response to the violence, British troops were then used to restore law and order, and so the relations between the colonists and the British authorities continued to go downhill. Now, throughout these years, these policies were decided and imposed by Parliament. Parliamentary ministers, not King George, were responsible for devising colonial policies, although, of course, George still had means of direct and indirect influence. But the policies themselves did not derive from King George, who had to preside royally over squabbling ministers, competing passions, and conflicting advisers. And George detested public disorder, whether it was at home or abroad. With his firmness on stability, law and order, and resistance to social change, it has to be admitted that he did not help his image with the colonists in far distant America. And then, of course, the British redcoats were always seen as the king's shoulders. So when they were used to establish or restore law and order, as on the occasion of the Boston Massacre in 1770, public ire was naturally transferred upwards to the royal governors and to the king himself. And then, in December 73, came the Boston Tea Party, and the dumping into harbour of 342 chests of tea imported by the British East India Company. This itself, again, had nothing to do with King George. It was the pushback to the Tea Act passed in May 1773, by which the British East India Company would be allowed to sell tea duty-free to the colonists. But of course the colonists would still have to pay tea tax. Although the Boston Tea Party was greeted by wild public acclaim, particularly in Boston, praise was not universal. George Washington personally expressed strong disapproval of what he quoted as their conduct in destroying the tea. And he said that Bostonians, quote, were mad, unquote. Benjamin Franklin called for the British East Indian Company to be reimbursed for the lost tea, and he even offered to pay for it himself. So having shown that King George was charged in the Declaration of Independence with wrongs that should have been more appropriately levelled in Parliament and the ministers of government in London, one is then left wondering, why then were the charges made so personal against him? Who was or were the instigators of that approach? Well, it's widely known that the first draft of the Declaration came from the skillful pen of Thomas Jefferson in June 1776. Indeed, if Thomas Jefferson had had his way with his original draft, the allegations would have been even more dramatic. Here is some of his original wording concerning slavery, and I'll just pause while you read that. This piratical warfare is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. That paragraph is pretty rich, coming from Jefferson, who over his life owned over 600 slaves. And the charge against George of supporting slavery and suppressing legislative attempts to prohibit itself is ironic, because early in his own teens, as part of his education, George had written a paper in which, as for the European practice of enslaving Africans, he wrote, quote, "The very reason urged for it will be perhaps sufficient to make us hold such practice in execration," unquote. And by one count, 41 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were slave owners, as shown in this picture here. And it's not surprising that when the draft declaration went to the Congress, Jefferson's rant against the king's role in slavery was carefully deleted from the final declaration. So then, in drafting, where did Thomas take his lead? An answer to that takes us to Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was the Peter Radford of his day. He was anti-monarchist, revolutionary, and a troublemaker. And Peter will probably charge me a price for saying all that. An answer to the question of Thomas Paine leads us to his pamphlet, Common Sense. And very few people read Common Sense these days, but I assure you it is well worth reading. It's firebrand stuff. Thomas Paine was, of course, also the author of that very powerful paper, The Rights of Man, published in 1791. But that was 15 years after the Declaration of Independence. So who was Thomas Paine? He was born in England in 1737, just a year before the birth of King George. Educated and articulate, as he grew up he had a series of jobs, and he never really settled into any of them. In April 1774, he had to sell his household possessions in order to avoid a spell in debtor's prison. And a couple of months later, he moved to London, where he met Benjamin Franklin, who suggested emigration to the American colonies, and he gave Paine a letter of introduction. And so Paine arrived in Philadelphia in November 1774. And in March 1775, he became the editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine. Now, Thomas Paine, like Peter Radford, has a very active revolutionary bee in his bonnet, or indeed several bees. On January the 10th, his pamphlet, Common Sense, was published. And you'll notice at the bottom it was signed anonymously as by an Englishman. And arriving as it did at a time of protests and significant revolutionary unrest, it was an immediate success. Indeed, it sold 100,000 copies in the first 3 months and was read throughout the colonies. And in Common Sense, Paine railed against monarchy and attacked King George, using a writing style that was fiery and easy to understand. In England, he said, a king hath little more to do than make war and give away places, which in plain terms is to impoverish the nation and set it together by the ears. And he went on with this. The hardened southern tempered terror of England. I disdain the wretch. That's strong stuff. Paine argued for independence in England and for a style of government that was new, namely a democratic republic, that more properly represented the interests of the people rather than those of the aristocracy. And in Paine's view, government was a necessary evil, and its sole purpose, however, should be to protect life, liberty, and property. He called hereditary succession an abominable practice, and that the practice of monarchy originated from sin. Britain, he said, only watched over America in order to secure its own economic well-being, and America should seize the opportunity to become independent. America, said Paine, no longer needed Britain's help and would be far better off without it. Now, Common Sense landed on fertile soil. The Revolutionary War had already begun. There was much ferment, scuffles with authorities, violent protests in the streets, Lexington and Concord in April '75, Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys storming Fort Ticonderoga in May 1775, and in July the Continental Congress approved the Olive Branch Petition in an appeal to George III, asking for his help to resolve the colonists' difference with Britain. But unfortunately, the Battle of Bunker Hill had taken place in June 1775, and that happened before the Olive Branch Petition arrived across the Atlantic in London. There was rising anger on both sides, and when the petition arrived on 1st of September, George, with his emphasis on law and order, stubbornly, and I have to admit unwisely, refused to receive it, on the grounds that he was not going to give official recognition to an unlawful Congress. And in addition, as a response to the report of the Battle of Bunker Hill, in August 1775, the King had issued a formal proclamation. And you may not be able to read underneath the proclamation, for suppressing rebellion and sedition. Issued as it was in the King's name, with a heading like this proclamation probably did the most damage to the King's image in the eyes of the colonists. These two actions had the effect of rupturing relations even further. And so passions were already running high when Common Sense was published in early 1776. So in June 1776, the Congress appointed a committee to draft a provisional declaration of independence. And the committee consisted of 5 men, including John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, but the drafting was primarily the work of Thomas Jefferson, who, with his skillful pen, drew heavily on the arguments set out by Thomas Paine. Now, I'm going to sidestep the challenge of rebutting the contents of the charges, although some of them were frankly nothing less than hyperbolic. That is not my purpose. The anger in Philadelphia, frankly, was indeed justified. But I'm simply aiming to show that by aiming personally at the King, the charges themselves were wrongly targeted. They should have been levelled at Parliament. And my argument is that George did not deserve to be pilloried so personally. So then, here we come to a speculation. Why were the charges made so personal? Jefferson was 33 years old, a lawyer, a rising politician. And John Adams later remarked of Jefferson that writings of his were handed about remarkable for the peculiar felicity of their expression. Did Jefferson truly believe that George was a tyrant, and personally responsible for all the things that he was eventually charged with in the Declaration of Independence? Or was it that he recognized that hyperbolic rhetoric directed personally at George III would probably have much more emotional success than words against the policies of an impersonal parliamentary ministerial government in London? Personally, I suspect the latter. And I'm told that lawyers have an axiom: when law is on your side, bang the law. When law is not on your side, bang the table. And so Jefferson, who knew that law was not on his side, that he was a revolutionary, and the law that passed in London was not on his side, he chose to bang the table. And of course, in Philadelphia, the objective was to replace the monarchy with an entirely different form of government. And so, as we all know, the Declaration was approved by Congress on July the 4th, 1776, and as they say, the rest is history. Now, the anger aroused among the colonists by all these frictions was understandable, particularly as the protest shifted to direct conflict and death and destruction of property caused by the Redcoats and their Hanoverian mercenaries. And there can also be little doubt that Parliament in London was clumsy and did not properly appreciate the full effects of the laws and the taxes that they laid so heavily on the American colonies. But the Declaration of Independence, rather than place the responsibility where it should have been placed, namely on Parliament, placed it squarely on George as the person whose assent made Parliament's acts into law. And as I've said, George was a constitutional monarch. He did not have veto power over Parliament. So then, could George have done more to avoid the vitriolic charges that were heaped upon him? He saw himself as paternalistic and the father of his people. But there can be no doubt that he regarded militant colonists who had taken up arms as being rebellions. Perhaps the problem was that in some ways King George was a prisoner of his position as a monarch and a prisoner of the attitudes of the 18th century. And the authors of these two books say that George's own conservatism and emphasis on continuity, privilege, law and religion got in the way of new social ideas and practices and changes to the institutions. And although he was a supporter of science and new inventions, as I said before, he was also in favour of established order and status quo. He certainly didn't want to lose the American colonies, as among other costs, it might lead to similar events elsewhere in the British Empire. And only a few years later, you remember, the French Revolution occurred and chopped off the head of the French king. In an age of hereditary monarchies, the idea of a republic with an elected head with term limits was a concept that's difficult for any king to understand, let alone to accept. Now, would it have made any difference if George had paid a visit to his American colonies in the years before the protest worsened? In the 1760s, he would probably have been warmly welcomed by the Royalists, and he might well have opened his mind to the necessary changes of policy. But such a visit would not actually have been possible, because apart from the difficulties of transatlantic travel at the time, there was an understanding that the monarch could not travel abroad without parliamentary approval. Indeed, George at that time was still the Elector of Hanover in Germany, but he never visited that inheritance, nor did he even visit Ireland and northern parts of Great Britain. So as it was, in 1776, at the age of 38, George was a king with many other responsibilities beyond the American colonies. He had a strong sense of duty and in many respects attractive personal qualities. He tended to be stubborn at times, and in certain key issues he was not always a wise ruler. But he was by no means a tyrannic despot. And the dictionary definition of a tyrant, and as this is an American audience, I shall give you the Merriam-Webster definition of a tyrant, is, quote, an absolute ruler unrestrained by law or constitution, unquote. Now, as I've explained, he was not an absolute ruler. He was constrained by laws over which he had no veto power. The Declaration of Independence is indeed a unique document. with a truly remarkable first two paragraphs, announcing a form of government entirely new to the 18th century. But frankly, folks, that language that followed was nothing more than political propaganda that should have been directed at Parliament. And it should not have been personal invective directed at King George. When George met President John Adams in London in June 1785, he told him this, quote, "I will be very frank with you. I was the last to consent to the separation, but the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I have always said, and I say now, that I will be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power," unquote. And John Adams, in a letter he wrote in 1822 to former US Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, said this of the Declaration of Independence. "I never believed George to be a tyrant, neither in disposition or in nature, and I thought the expression too passionate and too much scolding for so grave and solemn a document." So George was obstinate, and he certainly seriously misread the mood of the colonists. I cannot argue that he was entirely blameless, as his ministers in Parliament blundered on with their imposition of laws and taxes on the American colonists, but to be personally and histrionically pilloried 18 times in the Declaration of Independence and accused not once, not twice, but 3 times of being a tyrant. So, members of the jury, revolutionaries as you are, my case is that George was wrongfully accused. The charges should have been levelled at Parliament. My defence rests, and I give you King George III, not guilty as charged. Now, in ending, I'm going to ask one further minute of your indulgence. In 1727, George Frederick Handel was commissioned by George I to write an anthem for the coronation of George II. It's entitled Zadok the Priest, and it's a powerful choral piece. It's been performed at the coronation of every British monarch since 1727, and it will doubtless be performed again for the next coronation. Here, I hope, if I can make it work, is an extract of that particular piece. Well,
Playing guide says
God save the King. Now, sorry. There's some.
I know, I'm trying.
You're still working on it, all right. Anyway, any comments that you have I'd ask you to withhold any rotten eggs or bad tomatoes, but any comments that you might have? Yes, sir.
Is there any record of how George personally felt about how he was being depicted?
Yes. Until last year, or possibly this year, a large number of documents of his own handwriting and his own comments were in the archives in Windsor Castle. And they've now been digitized. And there are a lot of records. I mean, certainly he didn't want to lose the colonies, as I've said before, but his emphasis on law and order was probably predominant, but those records do exist, and they do show the fact that he was really rather against several of the measures that Parliament imposed. But as I've explained, he really had no authority to do anything about it. The same is true today. The Queen, it's not the power that the Queen has, it's the power that the Queen denies anyone else from having. That's the constitutional monarch. That is to say, everybody who takes an oath, who takes a position of high office in Great Britain today, actually I must say in England, Wales and Scotland, has to sign an oath of allegiance. And that oath of allegiance is to the Queen. The officers of the Army and Royal Air Force have to sign an oath of allegiance to the Queen. Oddly enough, officers of the Royal Navy are not required to sign it because the Royal Navy is a senior service and exists by royal prerogative. It's always been assumed that the loyalty of officers of the Royal Navy were taken for granted. It's another of the oddities of a country that has no written constitution. Similarly, in Parliament in London, there are 6 seats in Northern Ireland which were won in the election by members of the Sinn Féin. That's the party that argued for the independence on the reunification of Northern Ireland with Ireland. But because all the MPs are required to take an oath of allegiance to the Queen, and those 6 don't intend to do that, they never take their seats in the House of Commons. And so the people they represent are never represented in the House of Commons. All that is part of the oath of allegiance. The members of the Supreme Court have to take an oath of allegiance and a pledge of loyalty. And the oath of allegiance is personally to the Queen, the pledge of loyalty is to the values of freedom and liberty of Britain, which are 2 separate things. So in other words, although Parliament authorises the money and the budget for the military, and the Prime Minister makes the decisions, their loyalty doesn't go to the elected head, it goes to the monarch, it goes to the Queen. That's always been the case, and that's how a constitutional monarchy works. Yes, please.
A few comments, if you can hear me, do the math.
No.
Yeah? Try it without, but anyway.
This is from Ron Chernow's biography of Washington. Many columnists clung to the fairy tale of George III as a benign father figure enthralled to a wicked ministry. But George III enjoyed political control over both houses of Parliament from royal patronage. The members of Parliament owed their titles and their seats, maybe not all of them, many of them, to the king through money. That's from Joseph Ellis' American Creation. And also in his book, The Cause, he writes of George III's punitive policies against America. In June 1775, the olive branch of negotiation extended by moderate John Dixon, by the way, written by Thomas Jefferson in 1775, over a year before he wrote the Declaration of Independence. George III's speech in October 1775 repudiated the olive branch petition, said he had absolutely no reason to read it. He was the most, and this is a quote, the most ardent foe of reconciliation in the entire British government. He appointed the aggressive Lord Germain as secretary for the American colonies who wished to win the war in one decisive blow. Further, after the defeat of the British Army...
How much are you going to go on?
Saratoga-
I can answer all of that.
But let me finish.
All right, go on.
After the defeat of the British Army at Saratoga in 1778, Prime Minister North wished to back off from the war, as did Lords Sandwich, Amherst, and Generals Gage, Howe, and Burgoyne, who thought the war was unwinnable. But the King and Germain insisted on carrying on. Furthermore, even after Yorktown in 1781, the unreconstructed king refused to accept reality and wanted to throw even more resources into prosecuting a hopeless conflict. Now, he wasn't a tyrant, but he was no friend either to America or to Great Britain.
Well, I dispute it. I disagree with that. Firstly, as I said, all members of Parliament had to take an oath of allegiance to the crown, to the monarch. But they were, that was as far as it went. They had their own policies. George did not control the policies of Parliament. Parliament controlled the policies of Parliament. Parliament controlled the budget. Now, I also said right from the outset, I'm only dealing with the 16 years that he was King of America. Once, in fact, the Declaration of Independence was signed and America chose to go its own way, then, in fact, he was no longer the king. And sure, there was a war that went on to 1783 and the Battle of Yorktown. And sure, George did not want to lose the colonies, but he was no longer the king. He had his own view, but he was no longer the King of America. So, whilst that particular quotation that you read took one point of view, I would take a rather different point of view. That George, in fact, was an erudite, cultured, enlightened man who didn't want to lose the colonies, but lo and behold, events took place which were out of his hand and out of his power. That was the nature of the beast. I'll come to you in a minute, yeah? Yeah.
Me?
Yes, you.
Well, King George was dealing with what was going on in the colonies. What was going on in India at this time? And was he at all distracted? Were they looking for independence?
No. The East India Company at that time, the East India Company had established itself for trade purposes in India, and began to realize that in order to have a reasonable, peaceful way of doing things, they began to have their own soldiers to maintain law and order. And gradually the situation got more and more complicated, so that the British East India Company was eventually taken over. The administration of India was taken over by the British Parliament in London. But in the meantime, there were also arguments between the battles with the French in Madras, because the colonials, the imperialist countries of France and Britain had their fingers all the way around the world. So in fact, as I said, in the 7 Years' War in 1756 to 1763, there was fighting taking place over there, there was fighting taking place on the continental land of Europe, conflict taking place in North America, that is to say, in the American colonies and in Canada, and also in the Caribbean, and also in the Pacific islands over there. So the government in London and the government in Paris had a lot on their hands, trying to actually keep all these things at bay. Yeah, yes.
Can I just say a couple of things? Firstly, in response to the gentleman over there, the suggestion that the king controlled Parliament or that he appointed all these people is flat out wrong.
Yeah.
Parliament had chopped the king's head off in 1649, and after that, the monarchy, even though the monarchy was subsequently restored after Cromwell, the monarchy never had the power again that it had in the early part of the 17th century. People were elected. Now, they were not elected in a terribly democratic fashion, but all those people were the local aristocracy, they were the worthies, the people who owned the country estates and their friends and supporters. They were not the creation of the king. The other point that I was going to make was that we still blame whoever's in charge, don't we? I mean, we blame President Biden for the price of gas, we blame him for inflation, we blame him for all sorts of things, over which he has essentially no power whatever. We don't direct our anger and frustration all the time at Congress and say, why doesn't Congress do this? Well, we do that, but people in general have a very strong tendency to say, who's the guy in charge? And to say, well, he's the one that we want to hold responsible, he's the one we want to vote out.
I agree, that's true. But on the other hand, unlike President of the United States, the monarch in England had no power to give executive orders.
Well, that's right.
I mean, the power of the Crown, after the Act of Settlement in 1701, progressively deteriorated. It deteriorated under George III, it deteriorated further under George IV, under William, and under Queen Victoria. Parliament gradually but steadily asserted itself.
Yeah, I think the whole history of England over the last 1,000 years is essentially a reduction of the power of the monarchy and an increase in the power of the people in Parliament.
Yes, and the other thing is that, as you all know, this is a side comment, we have in England the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Now, unlike the Senate, and the House of Lords are not elected, but unlike the Senate, the House of Lords cannot stop an act which is a bill that is passed by the House of Commons. They can postpone it, they can delay it, and send it back for reconsideration. But if the House of Commons says, no, that's the bill that we want, then it has to go to the House of Lords, who have no authority to stop it. And once it's signed by the House of Lords, it has to go to the Queen, who has no authority to stop it either. So in fact, when people talk about perhaps there ought to be an elected House of Lords in London, I don't think you'll find a single Prime Minister who will be in favour of that, because the Prime Minister in the House of Commons would then lose power. And at the moment, all the power under a constitutional monarchy and the way we have it in the UK is in the hands of the Prime Minister of the House of Commons. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. The first question is, I have two questions. The first question is two components. You mentioned that that during the reign of George III, there was a notion that the monarch could not, indeed should not, travel abroad. And so one must, I guess, assume that this was a notion unique to Britain at the time, since we have examples of Emperor Joseph II and King Gustavus III, for example, who traveled widely. Why was there at that time this notion? I wonder if you know that. And when and how did that change? And my second question is, who is this fellow Peter Radford?
You don't want to know?
Let me deal easily with it. Peter Radford is a friend of mine. He's the current president of the Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning.
Oh, I see.
And he and I often meet and have sparring matches, and we took part in 4 GMAT debates, with him taking one side and me taking the other. And so whenever we get a chance to kick each other's shins, we do. And he's not here today, sorry, we kick his shins. Now, as far as the matter of the travel, that had been, again, it was Parliament that laid that imposition on the king. He could have travelled, of course, within the United Kingdom, within Great Britain, and he could have travelled, at that time, Ireland was also part of Great Britain and Ireland, which were together. But he either chose not to, or he was discouraged from doing so. At the time, he was also, of course, still the Elector of Hanover. George I, when he became king, couldn't speak a word of English, was Elector of Hanover, and that passed on, that heritage passed on through George II, George III, to George IV, and it was only in 1830 or so that heritage was taken away from King William IV.
But the vote had not been cast since the fall of the empire in 1806, in any event, right? The vote, no elector had ever cast a vote since Emperor Francis.
And of course, that was the reason why there were Hanoverian mercenaries who, as Elector of Hanover, he could engage and pay for, mercenaries from Hanover to assist the British troops down in the Bennington Old Cemetery. There are graves there, not only of the American colonists who were killed in the Battle of Bennington, but also some of the British soldiers and their Hanoverian mercenaries are buried in Bennington Cemetery. And then separately, down in Bennington Cemetery, there's a separate plot for the American loyalists who were killed, and the American revolutionaries who were against the loyalists would refuse to have those Americans buried in the same area. They're buried in a separate part of the area of the cemetery. Go on.
Derek, our present Queen, who's been Queen for 70 years now, has built up a reputation as being somebody who has consulted with her prime ministers, and she's had many prime ministers during that 70 years, and of course has gained enormous understanding of the parliamentary process. It is said that whilst she cannot make decisions on these things, she has accumulated such experience that she is able to provide an incoming prime minister with very pertinent advice as to how he should continue, he should manage Parliament, how he should deal with overseas affairs. Now, George, as has been said, he didn't travel. In fact, I think the farthest he went from out of London was to Weymouth, because there could be a relationship between the fact that he didn't travel and he had 15 children, but that's... but nevertheless, he did meet his subjects. Even if he didn't travel, he was popular within the United Kingdom, etc. I say United Kingdom because I'm not quite sure within the 16 years we're talking about whether the Northern Ireland was part of it, but anyway. So it's not really a question, it's really a comment that there is a man who didn't travel, ostensibly didn't go out and meet his subjects, but was very popular within his country, his kingdom, etc.
Yeah.
Would you have any comment on that?
Yeah. As I said, I think it was Macaulay, but it might have been somebody else, who defined a constitutional monarchy's duties as to consult, to advise, or to caution. Right? In other words, those three. And as you say, the present Queen, I think there have been 13 or 14 prime ministers in her time. There was a very successful London play. And the prime minister, the custom is that whilst the Commons is sitting, the prime minister has a personal call with the Queen every Tuesday, and that there's no one else in the room. There are no records ever taken of that conversation, and he can then pour out to the Queen in the full confidence that she's not going to tell anyone, even her corgi dogs, any concerns he has of troubles that he has in Parliament. On the other hand, I doubt whether she takes the initiative to advise unless the Prime Minister asked for the advice. I mean, she's so prudent over that issue. She is, as you say, she is held in high regard, something of the order of 75% or 80% popularity in the country. And that's because she is very carefully kept away from politics. The royal family is not entitled to vote. She has never expressed a vote. The Queen herself has no passport, because all the passports of the rest of us are in the Queen's name. So how could she have a passport for herself? The Queen's car never has a number plate, a tag plate. either front or back. I mean, there are these oddities that have been grown up over tradition. And part of the Queen's role, namely to caution, to advise, and to consult, is as far as she goes. And I suspect it's because she's kept very carefully to those tram lines that her popularity has been what it is. Every now and again, Prince Charles has expressed a view about the environment, or expressed a view about the architecture, and there has been an almost instant reaction, complaint, as to what's he doing interfering in matters like that. So whether the Queen's popularity will transfer to her son when he becomes king is a very big question mark. And I doubt that he will get anywhere near the popularity, he won't inherit anywhere near the popularity that she has. Yeah.
But would, is there any record of George meeting with his prime minister? Because there was, what, 4 or 5 prime ministers during it.
But Lord North was prime minister for most of the time of most of the time, for 12 of the 16 years, I think Lord North was the Prime Minister. Now, as I understand it, in part of these records that were asked about before, the archives, there are indeed records of his discussions and his views. Sometimes he agreed, sometimes he disagreed with Lord North. There were times when Lord North tried very hard to resign, and the King wouldn't let him, because the King didn't want anybody else in Lord North's place. Whether that was because Lord North was so weak of personality, he wasn't going to argue the toss with the King. I mean, I'm afraid I don't know. But there are indeed records in those archives of their conversations. And sometimes George made these records to himself. He wrote these notes to himself. George eventually, he had these first bouts of illness in I think 1778 was the first bout, which caused people to be a bit nervous, and then he recovered. But progressively, from 1799, and by 1800, he was, not only was he mad, he was writing page after page in one sentence. He was writing things. He was having private conversations with people who'd already died. He was becoming deaf and becoming blind, and in his last 10 years, he had to live most of that time in a straitjacket. That was the extent of his illness. But all that was way beyond 1776. And during that time, the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, became Prince Regent, which, for instance, if the Queen was to decide to, the present Queen was to decide to retire, but not die, then Prince Charles would not become king, he would become Prince Regent, until such time as she dies. And so that's another little quirk. I mean, I'm a loyal monarchist. I make no bones about it.
Derek, we have a question from the Zoom audience. It's from Bruce McLaury. Did loyalists in the colonies have a decidedly different view of King George? And was there any concerted effort in Britain to mobilize the loyalists on behalf of the king?
Did the loyalists have... I don't know whether there was any determined or decided effort to mobilize the loyalists. Down in Arlington, there is a road down there, that Don Keelan knows very well, called Tory Lane. And there were a number of loyalists down in Arlington. That's right, Don, isn't it?
That's correct.
That's right. And that Tory Lane is still there with that name today, indicating that there were several householders in Arlington who were loyal to the king. And of course, what happened after 1776 was that many of those actually fled to Canada, or some of them went back to England. But I don't know of any particular effort to try to mobilize the loyalists on behalf of the king done in London. Now, whether there was an effort over here amongst the loyalists, I'm afraid I don't know that either. Two questions and then we'll just do that. Yes.
This is kind of a follow-on to Steve's question, which was, with his reputation in the tank, did he ever write any document to sort of salvage his position or his perspective, or to clarify his perspective, or?
I think he probably did in his massive, there are thousands of pages of handwritten notes in the archives. I know they exist because I've seen on the internet the announcement that they exist, but I'm afraid I haven't read any of them, so I don't know whether he
That's
did
the
that.
next job, right?
Yeah, yeah. And behind you,
The loss of the American colonies, how did the British public react to that? And would you know, who did they largely blame for that loss?
how did the British public react to it? I suppose there must have been a mixture of feelings, as there often is. The exporters, the tradesmen, recognised that they lost the trade, and if you remember, there was still in the years immediately following 1776, there were captures of American merchant ship and taking American sailors to sail in the British ships because they were accustomed seafarers, and they knew how to hoist and lower the sails and all the other things. Whether there was, what was the other part of your question again?
Who would they have blamed largely?
Who they blamed?
Yes.
I don't know. I would imagine some people would have simply blamed the rebellious colonists. And typically these colonists, they go abroad there, they don't appreciate everything that's done for them. You can just imagine that kind of line. At the same time, back in England, there would be no real appreciation of the hard conditions that many of the colonists had to put up with, the living conditions. But there would be others who probably sort of said, "Well, good riddance," rather like there is a certain feeling in England today about Prince Harry. If he wants to go off and marry an American wife and live in luxury, good riddance. I mean, there are bound to be views on both sides. Yeah, yes. Go.
My father was born and raised in England, and in 1952 he took my older brother and me and our mother over to meet his family. And my grandfather said, "Is it okay if I take the boys over to the pub?" And of course my dad said, "Sure." So we walked a couple blocks away. As you know, the pub is the social life center in the area. And my grandfather walked in there and said to his friends, "These are my two grandsons from the colonies." We lived in New Jersey, and Duncan looked at me and said, we had no idea New Jersey was a British colony.
When you think about that, just think of some of the names of the East Coast colonies. Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Where do all those names come from?
Sure.
No? Yeah. Sorry.
I was going to, whoever was talking about how the British people thought about the war, they didn't get taxed more probably to finance the war effort. I would think they probably were happy with the colonies financially.
Yeah, I mean,
they get the money from somewhere to
yeah, I mean, the war still had to be paid for.
Yes.
And if the colonists weren't going to pay their share of the taxes, who the heck was going to pay? The answer is, yeah, you're right, that's another thing. You've all been very patient. Thank you very much.